Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, spending your Thursday evening with us. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Javier Fuentes and Stacey with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Javier's debut novel, Countries of Origin. But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, mask wearing is optional but encouraged tonight. If you'd like a mask, we've got some extras up at the front register where you checked in. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Javier will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Countries of Origin online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. This tender novel follows Demetrio, an undocumented pastry chef in New York, as he returns to his home country, Spain, to avoid deportation. What follows is an all-at-once sensual and suspenseful story of identity and belonging, of trust and connection, and of delicious, unforgettable food. Javier Fuentes is a Spanish-American writer and a 2018 Lambda Literary Fellow who earned an MFA in fiction from Columbia University, where he was a teaching fellow. Born in Barcelona, he lives here in New York. And as I mentioned earlier, Stacey joins Javier in conversation tonight. Stacey is the author of 4 novels and 1 book of nonfiction. Her essays, features, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Boston Review, and Plowshares, among many others. She is an associate professor of writing and publishing practices at Fordham University. All right, that's all for me. Without any further delay, please join me in giving Javier and Stacey a very warm welcome.
Make sure this is transmitting, right? And you can hear me? Okay, good. All right, Javi.
Hi.
I know we were just talking in the other room. I was Javi's teacher a long time ago.
Mentor.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. And I feel like we started this together. Could you talk about the journey of writing this book? I know that it's been a long one. And particularly, I wondered about border crossings, literal or figurative, that as a writer you might have felt that you made.
Yeah, it was just a very, very long journey. And I'll just start with a small anecdote. But I remember very clearly the day that I went into her office because she was going to be my thesis advisor. And I went to her with like these 9 pages that I had written that made a lot of sense to me, but I don't know, it made a lot of sense to turn those into 300 pages. So I just went there and she had just read them and we were like talking about it and I was like, well, I'm considering to like turn this into a novel. And then she looked at me and she was like, yeah, that's your novel. and I feel like, as she was like saying before, I wouldn't have received that information had I not felt that this was the novel I wanted to write. But at that moment, I remember like leaving her office, feeling so empowered to turn this into the book that I was going to spend years writing. I didn't know it was going to take almost a decade. Because then
I didn't say that part.
I didn't say that part. Because then, then you need to pay rent, and then you need to. Your dad gets sick, and life goes on, and then you sort of like slow down and you live with this for a long time. But in terms of like border crossing, I think is really interesting. The fact that I never thought, I don't think this is an autobiographical novel. I don't think it is. It's not. However, as I was writing it, and I was traveling back and forth to Spain, to home, though that's debatable now where home resides for me. I feel like the journey that Demetrio goes through, which is a more extreme version of my experience and my existence, but I could understand the fear because I felt that for a long time, I've been in New York for 25 years. For a really long time, I was here on working visas and student visas. And you never know when a bureaucrat is going to be like, oh no, I'm not signing this one. And then your life is gone. Like your life. You go back to Spain. I came out sexually here. I had a much more open, rewarding existence living on this side of the ocean. So I feel like that fear that connects with Dimitri and that sort of like border crossing that you're talking about, it's something that lives, deeply inside me, even though I don't think about it rationally that often. It is always there, and it kind of like surfaces at certain moments in life or in time.
I think actually it would be great to hear a little bit from the book.
Sure, absolutely. I read a little bit yesterday, so for the groupies in the room, I'm gonna read something that it sort of like continues to what happened before, and I'll just give you some context. So Dimitri is a pastry chef who's undocumented, and the book starts as he confides his legal status to his boss, who he's been working with for over 10 years. The stuff that I read yesterday was very much about him, sort of like confiding in him his legal status. And this is the moment where Chef and him go to visit an immigration lawyer. 13 days after I met Chef in his apartment, we went to see the immigration lawyer. The office was on the top floor of an Art Deco building in Midtown, with a heavy brass revolving door you had to lean on with your whole body to get it moving. We went up an elevator operated by a guy dressed in a green uniform with polished gold buttons. Tattooed on his neck, peeking over the white shirt collar, was a crown that I had seen on many kids from my old neighborhood, a sign generally marking a life that included time at Sing Sing. When we reached the 12th floor and the doors opened, we exchanged a glance that made him pull the collar a little higher. The office was spacious and filled with cold winter sunlight. In the center of the room, there was a long table covered with tall piles of manila folders that looked like rooftops seen from above. Nice setup, Chef said, taking a seat. He must have been doing well. We had exchanged few words since meeting at the front of the building. I was about to agree with when a thin, nervous-looking man entered the room. He smelled like cigarettes. We stood up. We greeted each other in French and kissed 3 times. I shook his smooth hand. His nails were manicured and glossy. He introduced himself to me in English. His name was Frederic, and the way he spoke made me feel I was already wasting his time. I explained my situation, but spared him the details I had shared with Chef. He asked for specific dates on the port of entry, his voice indicating a lack of hope. I answered sparingly, mimicking his tone. Then I told him that I had been paying taxes for almost 8 years, which to me, despite using a fake social security number, had always felt like a redeeming act. While I was in mid-sentence, he raised his hand, signaling me to stop. Framed by Harvard diplomas and photographs of handshakes with heads of state, Frederic spoke with a rehearsed iciness. You've been breaking the law for 16 years. Whether you're paying taxes or not is absolutely irrelevant. The only way for you to legally settle in this country is to leave the US, accept a 10-year ban, and then apply for a working visa. He sounded less like a lawyer and more like a judge delivering a verdict. But there's got to be a way, Chef said, uncrossing his leg. What if I adopt him and claim permanent residency for him? Unfortunately, that's not an option. You can only do that when the individual is underage. But what if he gets married? Chef asked, unwilling to give up. Are not, mon ami, he said in a patronizing tone. Things changed drastically after 9/11. The US CIS will find out he's breaking the law for years. Not to mention he will be breaking the law again, and I can possibly advise him to do that. Merde, Chef yelled as if he were talking to one of the cooks. Unfortunately, there's nothing to be done. 10 years is not a long time, he said, glancing at his BlackBerry. I smiled at him to hide how devastated I was. These words were not new, but hearing them in front of Chef made them irreversible and permanent. I no longer felt capable of keeping them at bay. I knew that from now on, Every time Chef look at me, he will see someone lesser, limited, someone with an inability to go further. The elevator ride down felt endless. I was filled with anger and despair for having deluded myself this past couple of weeks into thinking that at some point the door would open, when in truth, the door had shut the moment I entered the country. Since learning about my undocumented status almost a decade ago, I had been fabricating possible scenarios that would grant me some kind of amnesty, and had lost myself in the fantasy. Fucking Frederick, he's so fucking incompetent, Chef said as we walked out of the building. Sorry to have wasted your time, Chef. Don't be silly, we'll figure it out. We both knew there was nothing to figure out. Walking in silence, we found ourselves at Columbus Circle. We sat down on a freezing bench and admired the massive globe sculpture against the blue sky, its continents connected by concentric steel bars. I stared at the winter sun filtering through the shiny plates, forcing myself not to blink until my eyes hurt. At one point, Chef gave me a hug, mumbled something about Bush being an idiot, and walked briskly away.
That's great. Thank you. So I love that moment of him looking so, right, with his eyes open. And one thing it puts me in mind of is that the book, in many ways, is such a love letter to New York City, which today really needs it.
Yeah.
Why do we love this place? There's like this hyper specificity to the details. Tompkins Square Park, the real names of real restaurants, the real names of real clubs, Twilo and Vinyl, Florent of blessed memory. And I kept having this feeling that they were serving a purpose beyond like good detail, right? They felt much deeper than that. And that same, when we get to Madrid and we get to Spain, it is as vivid and as sensory, but I almost felt like the character was like memorizing the map, right? So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because it's such a striking and beautiful feature.
Yeah, this is such a smart observation. I feel like all those spaces that you're talking about that are in the book are spaces that have helped me become the person I am today. And it's been an intense journey to become, the queer person that I can speak here about, his sexuality and his immigration status. And I feel like all those spaces played a really important role in my life in terms of where I met incredible people, when I met lovers, where I met future boyfriends, best friends, lawyers at night, in the middle of this village at 7 a.m. So I feel like those spaces to me serve in a way as almost like as anchors for the character to come to life, right? And it's funny because like I started this process of sort of like pushing the book out into the world, and I'm very convinced this book is not autobiographical, but the more I think about it, the more connections I'm making about certain choices that I made. And I feel like space is an interesting one, because as I was saying the other day, space is something that through my creative process, or like, space is something that I don't imagine much. I imagine what happens in the space, but the spaces are real, and that happens in Madrid too. When I go to Madrid, I launch the Spanish version in this bar that I wasted my youth and being in that space is actually, this is the first bar that they go to when they arrive in Madrid, that they're like doing blow and I found like so interesting that I keep returning to those spaces, even though of course for us now whatever a Starbucks, but nothing against Starbucks, I love Starbucks, but you know what I mean, like whatever it is, but I feel myself returning to those spaces, not sure why.
That's great, because it's like, it's not an autobiography, here was my best friend in school, here was, whatever, but it's an autobiography of geography, right? An autobiography of spaces. And I think that's so true that those spaces, especially the spaces that you're talking about, hold so much, right? In this city, right? And for queer people in this city, which actually, which actually brings me to the character of Choose. Choose or Choose?
Choose.
Choose. So if you haven't read the book, which will be for sale, there's a character of Dimitri has a gay uncle who has essentially raised him in New York, and I was fascinated by Choose because he's really rich, he's really, really interesting, but he also feels like he specifically connects Demetrio to earlier generations of gay history, right? I mean, he really holds that. And I was thinking, I'm not sure I've ever seen a character quite like that before, like in that family kind of constellation. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you made him.
Yeah. I think, in my experience at least, living in New York, the queer community or the queer experience is very much based on mentorship. And at least in my experience, growing up here, like in my early 20s, I look for models and for people who will show me the way or will sort of like empower me to explore who I could become. And I feel like that is not sure that is no longer the case. I feel like with the internet and the apps and like everything is sort of like disseminated, right? But like back in the day, you could go to this village and like meet these older people and like learn a lot from what had happened there not that long ago, 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And writing Choose in that way maybe was a way for me to play homage to like that idea of the queer mentor who can both shelter you but also push you into danger to sort of like realize more who you can become.
That makes me wonder how you see yourself now in the lineage of queer writers, because you are now in it, right? I was having coffee with a trans friend like 2 weeks ago, and he was like, well, he had just turned 50, and he was like, well, all these like trans kids, like now I'm the elder. And he was sort of like, oh shit, I just got here. How do I, right? What am I going to be? But I wondered how, like, if there are particular writers that you steered by, and just sort of where you see yourself in this lineage.
Yeah, I feel like I'm pretty conventional. I feel I'm pretty conventional. I'm pretty conventional queer. When I think about those writers that I look up to, I think about Andrew Hollerhan. I think about Colm as being a big influence in my work. He was sort of like the writer. Actually, you pointed me at his work, and I found in that sort of like literary voice almost like a home for me, like almost like a space where I could exist. And when I meet all these like new like queer kids that they're telling me their stories, it's like they're just so much more advanced than I am. I don't think I'll ever get there. I feel like I want to be in my little corner, telling my little story about my gay characters. I don't feel I'm avant-garde in that way. I don't think I don't have it in me. I think it took me a while to sort of like carve the space that I can exist in, and don't have grandiose expectations of what I can do for the community. It's almost like when I read, I don't know if you read the Kingdom of Sand, Andrew's latest book.
No.
You have to read it.
Okay.
It's a book about a gay man dying alone in Miami, of all places, in Florida, of all places. And when I was reading the book, I was so broken just reading that book, because it really feels it's hopefully not, but it is a place where people like me and people of my generation that grew up a certain way, that's how they were supposed to die, right? And that feels very recent to me, even though, of course, I'm still very young and I live in an incredible city and have an incredible community. The fear of having to go through this world alone is something that has been hard for me to detach myself from. That sort of idea.
That's interesting. It suggests that maybe part of the material, if you were born before a certain year, right, is that terror almost, right? Although as you were talking, I was thinking that one thing that you share with the writer Colm Tóibín is this kind of continual conversation about sexual identity, but also about national identity, right? In this case, it's Irishness. And in the book, there's this sort of I kept on like translating the tropes back and forth, right? Like between countries, identity, crossing over, crossing back, right? And one of the things that's really, really moving in the book is that Demetrio essentially goes through kind of a one-way gate, right? Maybe a few one-way gates. And I wondered sort of where you see your work entering into conversations about identity of any kind.
Oh, I think it's very difficult for me to separate queerness from queerness from immigration, or from being queer from being an immigrant. And as I said before, I feel like that those are like two different ways of otherness are very intricate in my case. I think especially because I write in English. It's just so like I was born in Barcelona. I grew up in Spain until I was 22, and then I decided to write in English because English is the language where I'm most comfortable, I'm most me. So when I think about identity, who I am as a writer, it's almost like you're opening this other gate, which is sort of connected with the language that I feel I'm most complete in. And when I go and speak, I have lots of friends in Spain still, and I've been like writing a short piece about this. When I say the word homosexual, or I said the word homosexual, right? There's that resonance that the word has in Spanish still steers something in me that is connected to my being a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old, right? and sort of like this demonized notion of what being a homosexuality is, right? So I feel like, to try to answer your question, I feel like when I think about my identity, I think about queerness and language and how those are different states of foreignness, but they are in some sense is the same. Right?
So that makes me wonder. I know that the book came out in Spain just before, right? It came out here, and that you were reading from it and touring with it in Spain. Has the experience of publishing it in Spain been different for you than the experience of publishing it here, both personally, right, but also in terms of response? Because by now in Spain you must have had reviews and things like that, right? So, how is it different?
Yeah. I think like the most salient, and I won't get into the whole like translation aspect of it because it will take us 2 days to talk about that.
You didn't translate it yourself?
No, I didn't. Yeah. I didn't. It was like the smartest things I've done in my life. We'll have been like a complete rabbit hole. But to sort of like a small anecdote that speaks to what you're asking. When the book came out, literally the next day, they excerpted the whole first chapter in La Vanguardia. La Vanguardia is a pretty famous newspaper from Catalonia, it's a big thing in Barcelona, where I was born. In fact, I remember being a kid and like playing with like little cars like on the floor, and my dad like reading, like, which is like the same like New York Times format, right? So I remember him reading the newspaper, and then I got this whole like actually the whole first chapter. I was like, that's long. Guys, you know, clearly they're not Americans. They were just like people can read, you know. So even before I read that, I read the headline, and the headline said Javier Fuentes Barcelones, and I was like, what? Right? Like not even Spanish or not even Catalan,
They're
just like
claiming you.
I know, and it was such an interesting take on my identity that I was just not even like ready to unpack. Like my phones are like blowing up like Barcelones. I'm like, yep. So I feel like that gives you like a good sense of like how somewhat disorienting it is for me to have that sort of like aspect of my identity sort of like bubbling up at certain unexpected times always. And then reading part of the book, reading some sort of like chapters in public and reading words that are not quite mine. They are Andres Barba, who's an incredible author, that I convinced him to translate my book. He's from my generation too, which is great because I feel like we have that same sort of language toolbox, I guess. Was a little strange because I am more connected to what I wrote, because like it has a musicality for me that the Spanish doesn't have. It has a different kind of musicality, and even though I recognize it as okay, it's a different song, sounds like a different song, and it's a good song, it's not the song that I wrote and I composed. There's always this sort of I don't know, it's a feeling of not being able to encounter something in the space you're expecting it to be, right? It's sort of like it's just moved around, and you're like, wait, God, that was an incredible metaphor. Like, what? Things are moving. Okay.
It's just so interesting. I mean, it is just incredibly interesting, like the way things are like threaded in your consciousness. But actually, I also want to ask about the food, because obviously this is like a huge part of the book, and the descriptions of the food and the pastries that he makes are amazing. And so I'm sure everybody asked you this, but like, are you a baker? Like, are you into baking? Did you do research? I haven't known you to be a baker, but can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. It's funny. So I've been living in the Catskills pretty recently, and there is this guy who opened a great bakery. It's called Shandaken.
I know him.
And you know him. It's a very strange world.
I've known him for years.
It's a very strange world, Craig. So I gave him a copy, and I was like, "Hi, I'm the weird neighbor," with the book. So he read the book, and he was like, "Wait, how do you write this dessert? Like, they all make sense to him. Like, don't try to like bake any of the stuff that I wrote." But I think that, so to answer the question, is like it was a lot of research, and then I have a really good friend. I had a good friend that became a really good friend on a hiking trip in Big Sur, of all places, and he took me to the Big Sur Bakery. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's this magical place on top of the Pacific. It's like, and then like they make pastries, and so it was like. So I went there with him, and kind of like really, he started sort of like unpack. He was a really well-known pastry chef in New York, and he sort of like started like unpacking the book for me. And we were hiking, and we were camping on this cliff, and he brought it. Like if you ever travel with a pastry chef, I recommend it to everybody. They come in with like their whole like fridge and all these things, and he would just like start like making pastries like on the fire. It was just like this insane thing, and I got completely into not only pastries, but how pastry chefs think and who they are, because they're almost like I equal them with. I have like this really weird fascination with architects. So pastry chefs are like up in that level, you know. They're I feel like the part of like the chemistry, the really hard work that is needed in order to be able to do to perform these kinds of jobs. It's something that I'm fascinated with. I remember this friend of mine, he would take the subway at 3 in the morning in New York, like 3 in the morning, just like when everyone started to go out and back in the day, and we were going to Twilight, you know. And I don't know, I became enamored with that, the possibility of that life. And I knew it was going to take me a long time to write the book, you know, and I sort of like made that decision of like, okay, this is a world that I can exist in for a couple of years.
Well, I mean, making pastry like making novels, right? You know, do we need pastry? No. But do we want pastry? Yes. And right, and can it bring kind of profound experiences? Yes. I'll just ask one last question and then we'll open it up to you guys. There is a relationship between Demetrio and Jacobo, a man that he meets on the plane going to Madrid, and it's so particular, and they really have to go through a lot together to kind of get closer and be together, right? And I kept on feeling like you were making really specific decisions about how this intimacy was going to unfold. And I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. It felt very, in terms of the relationship among Demetrio, Jacobo, and the reader, I felt like you were saying like, no, you don't know where this is going. It's not going to be the way you think, right? We all had to kind of work a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a good way.
Yeah,
right.
no, and I was a very deliberate choice. I feel like I wanted to write a book that went against the expectations that you could have about anything, about queerness, about undocumented folks, about space, borders, nationalities, and I wasn't interested in like telling an expected story of two queer men meeting on the plane and having sex in the bathroom of the airport. I was more interested in like in telling that sort of like love story through these moments of missing each other, because I feel like that is where I feel like the intensity of the feelings really heighten. Right? So it's almost like they constantly miss each other. You know, when one makes a move, the other one misses it. When the other one makes a move, the other one misses it. And I feel like that is very true to the relationships that I've been most fascinated with. The relationships that never crystallize, right? Because I feel like we all have had long-term partnerships, and you can explain those very easily. It's very hard to try to explain those relationships that never happened, but you thought they could have happened in your life.
So on that note, what do you guys want to ask Javi? What do you want to talk about? Yeah.
Well, I know you said it will take a long time to explain the translation thing, but I think that's the kind of thing we want to hear about, especially because I came here and then I didn't buy the book initially because I wanted to buy it in Spanish, because I thought it was originally written in Spanish, but it's like the other way around, right? So that feeling of estrangement with your own work, is that a word? I would love to hear that, because I hear a lot about like Spanish-speaking writers and how it gets translated into English, but this is particularly interesting, I think, especially because your characters are Spanish, or some of them are, right? So how does that work? Yeah.
No, that's a great question, and I feel like we need to talk about it.
Yeah. So I have to repeat the question for the YouTube for our friends watching at home. So the question is about translating, and can we talk more about translating, and also about the really interesting aspect of this, which is that obviously you speak Spanish, right? You write in English. It was translated into Spanish, right? And all of these different permutations of of the of translating, which is fascinating.
Yeah. I'll answer that question in two ways. One from like a kind of like craft kind of way or practical kind of way. And another one is a bit more like theoretical. From a practical standpoint, I don't have the right ring in Spanish anymore. I've been here for 25 years. I live in this sort of like Anglo-Saxon world, and even though I sometimes read in Spanish, I mostly write in English. So trying to find the right note to write a novel, at least for me, is kind of like the most difficult aspect of it, right? Until you sort of like find that sort of like level where then it carries you. I did that in English, and then when they posed the question of whether I wanted to translate my own work, two things happened. One was I don't think I could have done it in time, right? Because I will have need to like dedicate myself fully for like a year to do it the way I wanted to do it. And then from a more sort of theoretical, maybe not the right word, but from a more sort of I guess like philosophical way, the author who's a translator that I picked for the book, his name is Andres Barba, and he's written incredible novels. And then he translated Moby Dick by Melville, and it was the first. And I didn't read the whole thing because I didn't have time, but I read kind of like half of it. And for the first time, I read an English book translating into Spanish in a Spanish that it was more universal, not so regional. And I guess like coming from Spain, my experience of like reading all these big, books in English, these sort of like masterpieces, is almost like translated by this with this sort of like very like localized kind of Spanish, which is weird because it's very exclusive of other Latin American countries. And what I loved about Andres' translation, and actually he talked about this, and that's why I reached out to him. He said like, enough, like basta. There's like enough with writing, translating these works in this sort of like localized, almost like private Spanish, right? And let's translate into this more like Pan-American Spanish, where everyone is sort of like invited to actually experience the book in a way that is not so local. So those kind of like were the two reasons why I didn't translate my work. Yeah.
Javier, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm curious about the otherness of the characters, and the otherness of the immigrant experience. It seems to me, for what you have been talking about, that the character feels very much at home in the U.S., and then somehow the immigration status doesn't allow that anchor, although he feels very much at home. And then since moving to Spain, also there's another anchoring. I wonder if you have any thoughts regarding the other angle or the other side of immigration, in which you don't belong here and you don't belong there. Perhaps our early immigrant experience, perhaps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like that is really what the book is trying to get to. Once you read it, you'll see that this is not a book where, he's forced out of the US and then goes to Spain and is like, I'm so happy in Spain. I should have come earlier. There is a lot of sort of that uncertainty about how he feels, both about the US and Spain. It's sort of like I don't want to give a lot away, but you realize halfway through the book that he exists in this liminal space where, as I said before, I feel like foreignness is sort of this fluid feeling, right? You think that I've spent many years asking myself, do I feel more American? Do I feel more Spanish? Like every time, sort of like almost like connected to like how much I master the language or not, or visas, and I feel like what I learned now is that foreignness is something that is never going to be stagnant. It's never going to be what you expect it to be, right? This last time that I went to Spain, that I went with this book that is my whole self, and I introduced it in Spanish, I had this sort of like visceral reaction, new reaction about how Spanish I feel or how American I feel. So I feel like the book is really all about, it's an exploration of the uncertainty of where you're from.
I don't have a question because I haven't read the book, but I just want to say that I'm so proud because I met you in 2010, I think. You were a creative director. I remember you every morning. You would say that you would wake up really early and write some pages because you wanted to be a writer. And I was like, the fuck? And here we are, 13 years later, having a conversation about this book. So amazing.
Thank you, thank you.
So for the YouTube audience, that was just like an I'm proud of you. I knew you back in the day. You said you were going to do this, and you did it.
I did it, yeah.
You did it. Is there another question? Yeah.
And you were talking about how it took you some time to write this book, and obviously any piece of art takes as long as it needs to take, and some pieces obviously could use a little bit more in the oven too, but I know life intrudes so much in that process, but was there a moment in the book, a chapter that intruded on the process as well, like that scared you, or that you didn't feel prepared for to write, or did you feel like you always had it, you just needed to spend more time in the oven?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like when you spend so much time, and I hope I don't spend as much time writing my second book. This is not the way to write a book. I feel like because I spent so much time, as Borja said, woke up at 5 a.m. for years. That's when I write. I got into this rhythm where I was part of this world, and I didn't rush things, and I didn't like make wrong turns at any moment. Which maybe like you should write it in a year and then make right turns and then come back and like get them right, you know? Like I'm not saying that this is the right way of doing it, but because I spent like so much time with it, it was almost sort of I was connected with kind of like the undercurrent happening in the book, where I knew exactly, maybe not exactly, but I had a really good compass, like internal compass at that point, or where the book needed to go. And where it ended up ending, which was one of those moments where kind of like I was like writing that page, and then I was like, oh my god, the book is ending. Like, oh my god, the book is ending. And then I wrote the last paragraph, and I was like, it's done. And it was kind of strange, because you know you've been working for so many years and like you've written so many pages, and you think that there will be this moment where you'll be like, and now I'm gonna write the ending, you know. And then suddenly, like the ending happens in front of you, and it's a very humbling moment.
Yeah.
You've always struck me as someone who resists labels. Now that the book is not yours, that it's in the public, how have you felt about its reception and how people want to talk about it? You feel they're talking about it in the way that you always wanted them to because you've been working on it for 10 years, or do you feel like sometimes it gets away from your comfort zone?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. It's very early on. There was only one review in the Times that I think that the reviewer got it right, got everything right about it, which was incredible to see. And I don't think a lot of writers have that opportunity, you know, getting like a review where the writer really understands what is at the core of the book. In terms of like labels, it's funny. I you know when I moved to New York, there were like sections in the bookstores where there were like the gay section with like the fiction, and you would go and you like flip through the page.
The shelf.
Exactly. For those 4 people who had the audacity to go and buy a gay book. I feel like that is no longer the case. I feel like now queer literature is really at the forefront of literature in general. So I'm not worried about how am I going to be labeled or categorized, because I feel like we've passed that. But I do worry about, how the book is going to be received, how people are going to get it. I feel like all the right fears that I feel like debut novelists might have.
Is there one more question? One last question? Something you really want to know? There's always things people really want to know, but then they come up to the writer after and say, what I wanted to ask was, anything? Yeah.
Well, do you want to talk about what you're working on next?
Sure. Yeah. So I started writing a book. I started writing before things got crazy with publication. I started writing, and it's funny because I feel like when I first sat down to write this book, I said I'm gonna write a book about an undocumented immigrant, and then you realize that is one aspect of the book, and then you've written a love story, So take this with a grain of salt. But there are a couple of things that I'm interested in the same way that I was interested about writing about the possibility of being expelled, and that is assisted suicide. That's something that has been in my mind for a long, long time. And I feel Spain has just passed a law where they legalize euthanasia.
Really?
Yeah, it's the place to go die. No. But it is of course this is the beginning of it. Right? This is the beginning of the journey, and it's incredibly complex to actually go through the process right now. But it is the first step, and it's gonna get get better. It's gonna get more sophisticated and sort of better thought out. But the right to end your life when you are not able to exist in a way that feels right to you is something that it's always interested me. And then modernism, architecture is something that I'm really into. Spaces again. So there's this incredible architect who lived in the 1950s, Horace Gifford, who built incredible modernist houses in Fire Island, and kind of didn't get the recognition he deserved. He had some sort of mental problems, and I was just thinking about maybe writing a fictionalized novel of his life, or maybe I'll probably end up not doing that, but sort of getting that inspiration, the inspiration from him, and sort of a queer architect from the 1950s, and then figuring out how assisted suicide enters in that sort of narrative. I think it's got kind of elements that I think could be a really interesting book.
Okay. All right, it sounds cheery. Okay, so I think that it's time for the signing, and Javi, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone who came out tonight. Thank you to all of those who asked fantastic questions. Thank you to Stacey for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And of course, thank you to Javier for celebrating this incredible debut launch with us. So a few quick reminders. For those of you still with us on the YouTube live stream, you can buy a copy of Countries of Origin by clicking the link in the live stream description. For all of those with us tonight, I know many of you picked up a copy when you checked in, but in case you didn't, we have plenty of additional copies available for purchase at the desk where you checked in tonight, which Javier will be around to sign and personalize for you. So that will be happening at the little desk next to where you checked in. If my coworker Aisha really fast could point to where that'll be happening. It's a little bit hidden, so it'll make sense in a minute. If all of you could just line up down the center aisle and kind of curve around. Please make sure to grab all of your personal belongings with you so that we can start to break down and rearrange the space. Am I forgetting anything else? Oh, we also have a few copies of Stacey's most recent novel, The Complexities.
Which is incredible.
It's a fantastic slow burn, suspenseful, criminal, familial novel. So I highly recommend checking that out as well. And I think that's it. Let's give these two one last round of applause.